I was very driven by wanting to fight socialism. Now, if you say that to a young person today, they'll probably look at you as if you're talking Greek. Of course,
Yeah, why would you want to fight socialism is what they'll say.
but when I was that age, the world was divided into two very, very sharp, conflicting political ideologies. It was communism versus capitalism. And the manifestation of that, of course, was the Cold War. But in individual Western societies, it was more likely to be socialism versus capitalism. But it was real socialism. It was red in tooth and claw. It wasn't Tony Blair's New Labour. It wasn't Keir Starmer. It was real socialism. And everybody knew which side they were on. You were on one side or the other. And you never heard people say to you on doorsteps in those days, oh, well, of course, it doesn't make any difference, because they knew it was going to make a really enormous difference as to which party won the general election, that the country would be run in two completely different ways. So we were very, very engaged. And I was a part of that.
So where did this idea of being against socialism, give us a little bit of why you think that socialism was such a bad idea, why you thought in those days it was such a menace to society? Where did this opposition to socialism come from?
That sort of socialism really was a menace to society. I mean, people were on strike more often than they were working. I was a commuter in the early 70s, travelling from the home counties into London. And you never knew if the trains were going to run. And it wasn't even always official strikes. You know, you had the wildcat strikes. You had the closed shop, whereby you were compelled to join a union before you'd even be allowed to do a particular sort of job. I mean, amazing as it may seem, they even had what they called the 10 o'clock rule, which was you all took up your work positions. And unless the management had said to you by 10 o'clock, actually, I want you somewhere else today, you couldn't move. I mean, it was that bad. People don't realise how bad it was. And it needed breaking. And it took Thatcher eventually to break it.
Yes, well, Thatcher is definitely a key influence of mine, definitely a figure that I have a lot of admiration for. It just seems in those days that, I mean, as someone who was born, I was born in 1997, so I definitely bypassed all that era. But even looking back on videos in terms of just how crippled society was by the looming threat of strikes and even the coal miners' strike and that, just how that sort of paralyzed society. I think there was definitely a need for someone to come and break that stranglehold on society, because yes, I believe in people's freedom to be part of a union and to involve themselves in that. But when the union is it became a mob really in society at that time. You know, that the union tried to almost coerce society into doing its bidding, and indeed enforcing that brand of politics. So did your background in conservative thought then, was that just part of your upbringing, or did you just see it as a result of, is it a result of seeing what the socialist ideals were doing to society at that time?
I think it was a mixture of both. My parents were conservatives, although because my father was a civil servant, he couldn't say so. Right. And in those days, it was much stricter in the civil service. You did not reveal your politics. Even if everybody guessed what they were, you still didn't say what they were. So I wasn't brought up in a family background whereby people jumped up on public platforms, but they were conservatives. But I think it was life itself that just cemented my view that it had to be the individual rather than the state, and it had to be people had to be free to work, and society had to be free to build a wealthy society, because that's the only way you have an NHS, a universal pension system, whatever it might be.
And did faith play a part in that politics in any way?
Well, I've always said that my idea of how a society should be run is based almost entirely on the Good Samaritan. Because, and I'm sure I don't need to remind your listeners of the parable, but effectively a man fell among thieves and he was eventually rescued by somebody from Samaria. And the Samaritan, of course, we know that he was traveling with a beast. He wasn't just on foot. We don't know what sort of beast it was, whether it was a horse, a camel, a mule, whatever it was. It carried oil and wine and bandages with which he was able to treat the man. He was then able to get the man onto his beast and take him to an inn. At the inn, he paid the innkeeper to look after him while he, the Samaritan, carried on his journey. Now, he couldn't have done any of that. He was probably a successful small businessman. He couldn't have done any of that if he hadn't been that much successful.
Well, I never really thought of it that way, to be fair. Actually, I haven't thought of what would have happened had he not had the means to do that. So, yeah, it's interesting because
what could he have done? Would have had no oil, no wine, no bandages, no money to pay the innkeeper.
Exactly,
and no beast to take him on.
Yes, he had to pay the innkeeper to look after him as well. So he must have had some kind of wealth. And it's interesting, you mentioned about the individual and collectivism. Would you say then that there's a faith-based argument for society being tilted slightly more towards individual liberty and the responsibility of the individual rather than collectivism?
Well, I believe that very strongly, because I believe that if you see a case of need, you have a duty to relieve it. You can't simply say, I've paid my taxes and it's the state's duty. You have a direct duty imposed on you by the requirement to love thy neighbour as thyself, and to, so I do think there is a considerable faith-based case for conservatism, yes.